In the United States, August 26 is Women's Equality Day, which marks the anniversary of the passage and ratification of the 19th Amendment in the U.S. Constitution, which gave women the right to vote after having been denied it for centuries. Most people have traditionally celebrated or have acknowledged the anniversary like the 19th Amendment enfranchised all women in the United States, except that's not actually how it worked initially. Hi, I'm Atima, Omara, political strategist and author of The Instigators, How Black Women Have Been Essential to American Democracy and What We Can Learn from Them, published by HarperCollins and available wherever books are sold. The 19th Amendment was ratified in the U.S. Constitution in 1920, but most Black women and many other women of color, Latinas, Asians, Native Americans, were actually not enfranchised when this amendment was ratified. A quick flashback. Black men had got the right to vote with the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870, right after the U.S. Civil War. But even those voting rights would end up being virtually meaningless in the southern United States, thanks to a brutal political and legal system passed by white Southerners called Jim Crow. The system of Jim Crow did a lot of things to restrict the civil rights of Black people, including controlling the outcomes of elections by placing barriers to the ballot box for Black men, like poll taxes, literacy tests, and physically violent suppression. The intent and the result was to reduce Black political power in voting and representation in government. So fast forward to when the 19th Amendment in 1920 was ratified. In the Jim Crow South, it just meant Black women would now join Black men in being actively disenfranchised. Black people weren't the only ones who were being kept from the ballot box in the U.S. at this time. Native Americans weren't even considered U.S. citizens legally in 1920. Yeah, that's right. People whose ancestors lived on the land that came to be known as the United States of America, who'd been there for at least a millennia prior, weren't considered citizens by the U.S. government. It was only the Snyder Act of 1924 that granted them U.S. citizenship, allowing both indigenous men and women access to the ballot, although they too experienced efforts to still keep them from voting in larger numbers. For example, challenging their residencies on reservations. Asian women were also excluded from the ballot box by a law called the Chinese Exclusion Act, passed in 1882, that prevented Asian immigrants from becoming U.S. citizens. And it was the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 that finally granted them full citizenship, and thus the right to vote. And for Latina women, they were often kept from the ballot box through deliberately discriminatory English literacy tests across the southwestern part of the United States. So, despite the 19th Amendment ratifying women's right to vote, the only group it applied to as a whole without any barriers was white women who weren't disabled, because disability voting rights, that's a whole nother video. So the ballot box remained inaccessible for most women of color until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, which finally barred all of these voting suppression tactics. And it was an update to the Voting Rights Act in 1975 that further ensured access to the ballot box, because that new law was updated to mandate election materials be printed in the language of, and I quote, applicable minority group and the English language. All of this was made possible because in the 45 years between the 19th Amendment being ratified in 1920 to the Voting Rights Act being passed in 1965 is because Black women, instigators, never gave up on the fight for Black suffrage and larger civil rights, even though many of their white women activist counterparts did so once they secured voting rights for themselves in 1920. There are two examples of just how extensive and dangerous this fight for voting rights was, especially for Black women. In Alabama, voters had to fill out a 4-page application, swear an oath, pass a literacy test, and pay a tax. One woman, Indiana Little, had had enough of this, and on January 18, 1926, she led between a few hundred to 1,000 Black men and women to the voting registrar's office in an attempt to get Black citizens registered to vote. For her attempt, she was arrested, jailed, and beaten. In Florida, another instigator, Mary McLeod Bethune, faced off against the Ku Klux Klan in defense of black voting rights in Daytona, Florida's mayor's race in 1922 when she tried to register black women to vote. These instigators, they organized in their churches and civil rights organizations with black men like the NAACP, but they also formed black women's clubs that centered the concerns of black women's civil rights and advancement, like the National Association of Colored Women, which was made up of multiple clubs of black women at the state and local level, and which eventually evolved into the National Council for Negro Women, which exists to this day. They had to do this because they didn't find common cause often with a lot of the white women's suffrage groups. The road to suffrage for all women was a long and hard one. However, the story doesn't end happily there with the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. In 2026, after years of counterattacks in right-wing media and politics, the Voting Rights Act has been gutted in a Supreme Court decision called Louisiana v. Callais. And there have been continued efforts underway to try to pass the SAVE Act that would disenfranchise women in the U.S., particularly married women. It is a reminder that in a democracy, to stay free, one must be vigilant and remain active. The full story of the original fight for voting rights for everyone and how it has again eroded over time and the activists still organizing for these rights, I write about in my book, The Instigators. If this changed how you think about August 26th, check out the link at the top of the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.